When you die in the game, you die in real life. For better or for worse, no one in our world has implemented this particular game mechanic yet. So in its absence, game designers have to decide what happens when you fail in a video game. The history of games shows us that the answer to this question has never stopped evolving. So let's talk about it. I am going to discuss several specific games that are relevant to the history of death within video games. But the history of games is ultimately a means to an end for us. My goal is to explore how the narrative and mechanical framing of death within video games has shifted, and how that affects our experience as players. If you are a purist and want to avoid any spoilers, here's a list of games that will be discussed, or at least mentioned in passing. I'm not planning to discuss major plot reveals for most of these games, but I've definitely been caught off guard by minor spoilers in video essays before, so here's an attempt to avoid that. Of course, this list, like this whole video, is guided by my own experience. If there's a particularly interesting example that I don't bring up, be sure to let me know. So, without further ado. In many of the oldest games, failure was assumed. In the heyday of arcades, games were designed to eat quarters to keep you playing, and once you stopped feeding the machine, you were accepting the finality of the words, game over. It was an experience that you were engaging with for a limited time, and weren't expected to ever finish. With the advent of home consoles, however, players began to increasingly expect that they could actually complete the games they purchased, and early console games had a variety of strategies to enable this. In some games, you could write down a code that would allow you to skip levels and continue a game from where you left off. Games like Mega Man were also intentionally designed so that as you became familiar with the level layouts, you could clear content quickly, so once you had mastered the game, you could potentially get through it in a single sitting. And a few games introduced the idea of actually saving your game. This was by no means the norm in the era of the NES or Atari, and games like Final Fantasy required you to hold the reset button while pressing power in order to make sure that this novel technique worked. Fast forward a few years, and save points or checkpoints had become a universal assumption in game design. Saving a game not only maintains your progress over multiple sessions, but allows you to effectively rewind time in the event that you fail. In many games, your character dies repeatedly as you explore the virtual world, and each time, you revert to your last save and continue as if that death had simply never happened. As game narratives became more complex, a silent friction grew between game mechanics and narrative. From the player's perspective, a game could be a brutal struggle, rife with failure. But from the perspective of the character we controlled, every failure was a possibility that had been erased. The characters had never known failure. Few games captured this dichotomy better than the Devil May Cry series, which features protagonist Dante laughing and executing daredevil stunts in the face of mortal danger. His protagonist status is the foundation of his entire personality, and yet, as a player engaging with this game, we are only able to make a small handful of mistakes before facing failure. This gives us a strange relationship with the character we control, for either we see ourselves as Dante's guardian angel, the Force repeatedly struggling to keep him alive in a danger-laden world, for which he seems to show little gratitude, by the way, or we begin to feel that the Dante in the story and the Dante we control are two separate people. This is equally jarring the other way around, too. When the character is confronted with a threat that we as players could have overcome, but fails in a cutscene out of our control, the game brings our attention to the fact that our agency is an illusion. We often identify with characters we control in games, saying things like, "I beat Virgil," or "I romanced Yennefer." It's generally disappointing when the game goes out of its way to remind you that you did no such thing. The protagonist did those things, and you simply enabled it by playing the game. What's more, when a game features death that can be undone in the game's mechanics, but is permanent when it occurs in a story sequence, it leaves awkward narrative questions. Why are some deaths treated as more real or permanent? Did our protagonists just forget that they have Phoenix Downs in their inventory? For many years, this friction seemed like an unavoidable part of gaming. There were outliers, such as the classic game Rogue, but they were exceptions that only reinforced the broader rule. But in 2009, 2 games came out that directly confronted this friction and resolved it in opposite directions. In the 2000s, indie games were a small and niche market. The modern concept of indie games as polished, well-crafted alternatives to the AAA market was only just starting to emerge as new platforms made distribution a lower barrier of entry to small developers. One of the games that came out during this time and shifted our collective perspective on indie games was Braid. Braid was a puzzle platformer, and it resolved the narrative friction around failure by giving the player the ability to rewind time and undo their mistakes. Time-bending mechanics had appeared in games before, but Braid made this mechanic the very center of both its gameplay and story. You could rewind time not just to undo your mistakes, but also to subtly manipulate the scenario itself, gradually twisting and rewriting the level until the unsolvable became solvable. And yet, at the end of each level, you were met with the same message. The princess is in another castle. Braid is about... well, there's a lot of debate about that actually, but one reading is that it's about a person dealing with a failed relationship, and the rewinding mechanic reflects our real-world tendency to imagine going back and remaking key decisions, of undoing our mistakes. And yet, by replaying our memories again and again, imagining slightly different decisions we could have made, the memory itself gradually twists and alters under our effort until it conforms to our wish, and we imagine the path we could have taken to success. Each time we succeed in imagining ourselves reaching that goal, our satisfaction mixes together with hollowness, because we know that the story we've told ourselves is a little untrue. And yet it is this process of working through each mental puzzle, of struggling with each question and each doubt, that eventually leads us through grief and makes us able to move forward. In short, Braid takes the perfectionist instinct common in puzzle gamers and weaponizes it against us to tell a story about our own struggle to accept the past. And speaking of struggling through a mental palace of doubt and meaninglessness, it's time for a word about the sponsor of today's video, Existential Angst. Do you ever feel a crushing weight of anxiety or sadness? What if instead of feeling small and insignificant, you felt insignificant and a little fancy? Make it existential. You could read the writings of Sartre or Kierkegaard and tackle complex philosophical ideas. Or you can go to silentellipsis.com to get 50% off of a certification that your angst is indeed existential. That's right, you can imbue your suffering with meaning today and get 50% off by visiting the URL in the description. Every purchase supports this channel and may or may not momentarily amuse you. Now, back to the video. So Braid represents one extreme of what we might call the death spectrum. Within both the narrative and mechanics of the game, there is no death, no true failure. Simply more and more iterations and manipulations, leading both us and our protagonist through the story. The result is compelling, and definitely had an impact on the evolution of the indie game industry, but it left an unanswered question. What would the exact opposite resolution of this friction look like? What if you had a game that embraced death and made it central to both gameplay and story? The game that answered this question was Demon's Souls, the lesser-known predecessor of Dark Souls, which in turn spawned an entire new gaming genre. Given the eventual mainstream success of Dark Souls, it's difficult now to explain just how bizarre Demon's Souls was when it first came out. See, back in 2009, there was a trend towards narrative power creep. Mini-games were trying to one-up others for visual spectacle and the ethereal concept of being epic, epitomized by this Control-Alt-Delete comic, joking that Gears of War, famous for guns with chainsaws attached to them, could only be more epic by including guns with trains attached to them. This deep need for games to one-up themselves was, in my eyes, a natural consequence of the narrative friction I've been talking about. Gamers had become accustomed to the idea that there were no real stakes in a video game. No matter how big the monster, there would be an equally large gun to shoot it with. And if you missed, you would just revert to a checkpoint and try again until you hit it. There was a feeling of inevitability to many gameplay experiences that drained them of the drama they so desperately wanted to evoke. So with all that in mind, here's the tutorial of Demon's Souls. My footage is from the PS5 remake, by the way, because that was simply easier footage for me to get. The game explains how to attack, how to guard, and then has you face down gradually stronger humanoid opponents as you make your way down the tutorial path. There's our friend Stabby Guy, and then Guy with Sword, and then Plate Armor Guy. If you pick up the mechanics quickly, you can make it through all of these enemies and begin to feel confident. Then, you step through a fog door to face an enormous demon, who summarily kills you. Rather than going back to a checkpoint and trying again, the game simply continues. You died, but your soul is trapped within the Nexus and cannot pass on to any kind of afterlife. Instead, you play as a wandering spirit, and without a proper body, your health is cut in half. Now each enemy you encounter can end you with a handful of attacks, and each time you fall, you drop all of your accumulated currency, other souls. What's more, every item you used from your inventory remains used after death. You aren't rewinding and pretending that failure didn't happen. You are continuing and facing the consequences of failure. And you do fail. A lot. So you become cautious and start expecting threats around every corner. You consider turning around and heading back every time you accumulate a decent haul of souls, rather than venturing on and risking it all. But you can't get your body back, and you can't even level up until you defeat a demon and claim its titular soul. Of course, when a generic guy with a spear is a serious threat, the idea of slaying a demon seems downright impossible. As you struggle through, you reach a point where there are only a few paths available. One ends in a red-eyed knight, who kills you. One ends with a dragon, who kills you. And another ends with a bridge, smothered with enemies. As you make your way across, that same dragon appears and kills you. The game is brutal, and instead of cutting you slack, when you head back to the Nexus, there's an NPC who tells you that you should just give up. The developers really made a game that tells you to stop playing it. And at the time, many people listened. For a few of my own friends, this was where Demon's Souls ended, with frustration and confusion. I avoided the game for a while myself because the feedback I heard was simply, "It sucks." When I did give Demon's Souls a try, I made it back to this turning point, where every path seemed to end in certain death. It had been a struggle just to make it through the first level, and the prospect of losing all of my carefully gathered souls and progress was petrifying. But I realized that my options were to surrender, or to defy death and try. So I watched the dragon carefully, waited for an opening, and sprinted across the bridge, and survived. The game immediately rewards you with a switch that opens the path to the first boss, as well as a shortcut. And I felt like this difficult, imposing game had just given me a nod and a wink. It was doing everything in its power to convince me that it was unfair and unbeatable. But the secret that I gradually discovered by playing it is that the game was much more fair than it seemed. This ebb and flow of tension and release is the core of Demon's Souls' design, and it felt entirely novel to me. I had played difficult games before, and I had played games with horror elements before. The thing is, this wasn't just a challenge to overcome, nor was it relying on jump scares to frighten me. Rather, the tension in question was a feeling that the game slowly built up over the course of each level, using the actual consequence of death to create stakes for the player that matched those of the character. And rather than feeling frustrated at the prospect of losing progress, I felt that a game was finally handing me the ability to become invested, to connect my experience of playing the game to the narrative of the game. Playing Demon's Souls felt like manifesting my own deepest fears and personal demons into a video game, and then building up the courage to confront them. It wasn't really about the difficulty per se, but about taking narrative threats seriously in a way that made overcoming those threats more meaningful. This was the power of diegetic death. The word diegetic is most frequently used in the context of music, to describe music that exists within a narrative, that can be heard by both the audience and the characters within a scene. To apply this concept to death, and then build an entire game out from this concept, was revelatory. And Demon's Souls didn't stop there, by the way. It included systems that seemed downright mad, such as the ability for other players to enter your game, to either help you or attack you. It included a system called World Tendency, that mysteriously made areas harder or opened secret paths based on how much the entire online player base was struggling with that particular region. It was an eccentric, confusing game that seemed intent on scaring you away from it. And that's exactly why I fell in love with it. And yet, it's still hard to capture, or even explain how this game felt in 2009, because the mechanic of diegetic death has been reused and repurposed many times now. Not only does it reappear in subsequent FromSoft games and Souls-likes, but it became the conceptual underpinning for the entire roguelite genre as well. Rogue Legacy, in 2013, introduced a loophole to permanent character death that builds upon the logic of Demon's Souls. Upon defeat, your character dies, but their legacy is carried on by their descendants. Add in random mutations in your heir, and procedurally generated levels, and the game will continue to feel fresh on each playthrough. Meanwhile, there is a kind of permanent progress you make each run by improving your keep, even though the run itself begins from scratch. Subsequent roguelite games built variation on this idea of in-narrative death, paired with gradual progress beyond an individual playthrough. And games like Hades truly embraced the narrative potential of death within the narrative, as each loss sends you back to the underworld, gradually unlocking more conversations and complex relationships with the denizens of that realm. The game is theoretically about escaping from Hades, but it is only through failure that you can come to understand why you are trying to escape in the first place. But like any game mechanic, the deep intentionality of diegetic death found in Demon Souls began to slowly erode as it became a normal part of the modern game design formula. There was a video about Bloodborne several years back from a somewhat obscure YouTuber called HBomberGuy, where he discussed an idea he called play conditioning. In short, he argued that by training players to ditch shields and use a faster-paced, dodge-focused playstyle, Bloodborne had not only become more fun than earlier Souls games, but taught players how to go back and better enjoy previous titles. This point was later picked up by Adam Millard, who made a video about it labeled, "How Dark Souls Accidentally Taught You Cowardice." These are both good videos with interesting points, but there's an assumption underlying HBomberGuy's video, which in Adam Millard's video matures into something very close to simply being wrong. The assumption is that the intended underlying experience of the Souls series is to provide exciting, tough but fair combat challenges and memorable bosses. Anything that engenders passivity and overcautious gameplay, such as shields, detract from the fun of the game. But if you look at the progenitor of the series and think about what I've said so far, inspiring cowardice wasn't an accident. It was kind of the whole point. Demon Souls was about narratively and mechanically taking death seriously. Again, satisfyingly difficult, fast-paced action games already existed before 2009. Think back to my comments on Devil May Cry. What made the burgeoning Souls series feel unique was all of the ways that it defied the conventions of such games, by slowing the game down and forcing you to take even small threats seriously. Demon Souls was less focused on mechanical difficulty and more focused on creating psychological challenges for the player to confront. The game made death consequential, and within its narrative, made it clear that reviving again and again wasn't a gift, but a kind of curse. Demon Souls is about finding the willpower to overcome your fate and escape from an endless cycle of reincarnation. The thing is, due to the subsequent success of Dark Souls, just a few years after its release, the proverbial cat was out of its equally proverbial bag. Players understood that the secret to mastering Souls games was perseverance, and that as long as you prepare to die, and have decent dodge timing, you can eventually succeed. It was impossible to ever recapture the strange novelty of Demon Souls, and FromSoft evolved with its players. Dark Souls did include some of the tension and release gameplay that defined Demon Souls, such as the infamous Blight Town, and Dark Souls 2 put a heavy narrative emphasis on the existential horror of going hollow. Over time, however, diegetic death became more of a mechanic than a centerpiece of gameplay, and later games like Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and especially Sekiro are much more focused on fast-paced, mechanically challenging boss fights. Now, they certainly do deliver on that front, but the ludo-narrative tension of death has gradually drifted into the background, and players have come to assume that repeatedly dying to a boss is a normal part of the experience. Meanwhile, indie games picked up on the cyclical death concept and repeated it so often that it has become something of a cliché. Games like Slay the Spire and Dead Cells used the cyclical nature of the game as a way to make the relationship between gameplay and story feel more organic, while games like Undertale used such mechanics to directly challenge how the player perceives the world they're interacting with. But today, when I encounter a game that says, "This has all happened before, we're both trapped in a cycle," it's hard to get worked up about it anymore. No shade to Monster Train, by the way. It's a solid game, but it was the umpteenth version of this I had encountered. So now let's consider the design of Elden Ring, by far the most popular game yet to carry on the legacy of Demon Souls. Within the narrative, returning from death explicitly happens at the beginning of the story, and is implied to be happening throughout the game, but it's never perfectly clear. Mechanically, death in Elden Ring can carry permanent consequences, but the game adds Stakes of Marika to serve as additional checkpoints outside of most boss fights, and gives you the ability to fast travel to any site of grace you visited before. Two features that, together, make it trivial to reattempt any boss giving you trouble. Now I know that long boss runbacks aren't exactly fun, but inconvenience was an intentional part of Demon Souls' design, and part of what powered its ludonarrative tension. For the admirable increase in accessibility in Elden Ring, there is still something lost. And there's something even more subtle and insidious that breaks the ludonarrative synergy of its forebears. Phase 2 boss cutscenes. You see, many of the bosses in Elden Ring have a cutscene to introduce them when you first enter their arena, and another when you get them down to half health, or whatever threshold triggers their second phase. These are, admittedly, not just dramatic, but often downright metal, with some bosses cutting off limbs, pulling swords out of bodies, or truly passing the point of no return by taking off their clothes. The problem is, if you die to the boss, you'll return to the site of grace outside of their arena, and they will return to Phase 1. Limbs will be mysteriously reattached. Clothes will be mysteriously redonned. It's almost like, instead of being revived, you're turning back time and undoing everything since your last checkpoint. It's almost like, slowly but surely, the ludonarrative friction of save games is being reinvented from scratch. To be clear, I love Elden Ring, and letting your games evolve and become more accessible isn't a bad thing. But From Software, and the many games that have been inspired by them, have arrived at something of a turning point. As happens to most game mechanics, diegetic death became normal. It became expected, and then it became a background consideration. And the various game mechanics it arose to replace have started to seep back into the formula. From here, it either needs to be re-envisioned or forgotten. Perhaps this is why FromSoft has announced a few more experimental titles. Both Night Rain and the upcoming Duskbloods seem like they are borrowing lessons from the roguelite genre, and might be part of a larger effort by the studio most famous for shifting our perspective on death to reinvent itself yet again. I think I'd prefer that to the studio simply repeating its successes until they finally feel stale. For every other game designer out there, the point is not to fixate on what worked so well in 2009, but to remember that death, like every other aspect of a game or story, is an opportunity. We can see player failure as an uncomfortable inevitability to rush through in game design. Or we can see it as a chance to use the unique language of games to have players confront and interact with the most terrifying aspect of being alive. Each time we fail, we will have an instinctive drive to turn back time, to undo our mistakes. But if we instead learn to let go, to let one version of ourselves die, then we will allow a new version of ourselves to be born. And maybe this time, we'll see things differently. In the context of video games, that poetic little thought doesn't even need to be a metaphor. If you're wondering about this new series title, Ludologica, it derives from ludology, the study of games. Academics interested in video games have long struggled with what to call their field, in part because the phrase game theory was already taken by a different academic discipline that doesn't really have to do with games, which is quite rude, to be honest. The other thing to know about the word ludology is that it has been popular in certain circles to contrast it with narratology. Basically, there has been some debate about whether video games should be analyzed as stories, similar to books and film, or if they are a fundamentally different kind of experience that need to be examined first and foremost in terms of gameplay. The answer, of course, is both, and I always thought this debate was a little silly. I, for one, am not a huge fan of games that seem to believe that they are just movies with interactive bits added in, but it's clearly the case that many people get deeply invested in the stories of games whether or not they've even played the game in question. Games are, by their nature, a synthesis of many different art forms. They contain music, visual art, story, and gameplay. The very best games have all of these elements interact with each other, but it makes just as much sense to take any one of those elements and talk about it on its own. That's just the nature of a medium that contains other media within it. In any case, you can expect more Ludologica episodes in the future, as well as deeper dives into specific games. Speaking of which, if you're a fan of my Elden Ring videos, then I have not one, but 3 exciting announcements about the Grand Unified Theory. Firstly, I'm going to provide some overdue follow-up in the form of Gut Check, where I'll respond to some frequently asked questions. I'll also add back in several neat details that I cut from my scripts, and try to provide a concise summary of what my overall point was. Second, I'm planning to release several of my videos in podcast format. A friend of mine is a sound designer and is helping me to figure out how to improve my sound quality and turn this stuff into a podcast. So if you want a sound-only version of my content, or have friends who don't watch YouTube for whatever reason, that'll be coming soon. Finally, since I'm updating the sound anyway, I'm hoping to release a remastered version of the Grand Unified Theory in one video. Also, I have finally started a Patreon. So far, all of my content has been made as a part-time endeavor while I work a different job. But with your support, I'll be able to focus more of my time on content creation. And I'm sure the algorithm just shudders to imagine what a full-time Silent Ellipsis channel would be capable of. As ever, thank you for watching, and make sure that the algorithm knows that this is some engaging content. Until next time.